Welcome to the City Biz audience today. I am Fred Hill, and I am delighted to introduce Gerry Brewster. Gerry, a new book has recently come out, a biography of your father, who is both a war hero and a United States Senator. Tell us about the origins of the book, Self-Destruction, The Rise, Fall, and Redemption of U.S. Senator Daniel B. Brewster by John W. Fries.
Thank you, Fred. And first of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to conduct this interview. I also want to thank Edwin Warfield, who has a long and distinguished family history in Maryland, from his great-grandfather, who was governor of our state, to his father, who was Adjutant General of the Maryland National Guard. And Edwin has made such great contributions through his various publications and now through City Biz. The interviews that are now in the City Biz library have been tremendously helpful to all of us. With regard to the book that just came out on my father, it's the fourth book by author John W. Fries, and its origins are really interesting. When I was serving in the Maryland House of Delegates, the head of the Baltimore Sun Paper's Annapolis Bureau was John Fries, so he covered me. And then he wrote several books, and I saw him at a party for U.S. Senator Joe Tidings, and we discussed what he might do next. And I mentioned, the Danny Brewster story would make an interesting book, and he didn't think so. And I said, well, I wrote my senior thesis at Princeton on my father's political career and his legacy. Why don't you take a look at it? So John read my senior thesis from Princeton. He found it fascinating, things he never knew before, a real eye-opener on the pivotal time in our nation's history. And he said, I want to write this book. Will the family support it? And we said, yes, we have one requirement. And he said, what's that? And we said, that you tell the truth, don't sugarcoat it. And he wrote a very well-researched, very honest accounting of the ups and downs of my father's life.
Gerry, your father was a direct descendant of Benjamin Franklin, had a family that fought in wars, World War I, World War II. Others held elective office and were leaders of industry. Your father had every opportunity in life, but things got off to a rocky start. How so?
Yes, my father was the fifth great-grandson of founding father Benjamin Franklin. His grandfather, Benjamin Harris Brewster, was Attorney General of the United States. He was descended from multiple cabinet members, senators, and a vice president. Everything seemed to be going his way. He had a family of great wealth, status, opportunity. But then when he was just 10 years old, his father died of alcoholism. And my father at that point was the oldest of 5 kids. So at age 10, Danny Brewster, my father, became the man of the house, looking out for his widowed mother and his 4 younger siblings. That was a lot for a 10-year-old boy to take care of. And that was the first sign that in spite of the privilege, in spite of the opportunity, in spite of the wealth, there might be a rocky road ahead.
Your father was reportedly the youngest combat Marine officer in World War II and wounded 7 times in the Battle of Okinawa, the deadliest battle in the Pacific, due partly to the Japanese use of kamikaze attacks as the war was ending and they were getting more desperate. Tell us about his wartime experiences as a Marine after leaving Princeton.
Yes, after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in a devastating blow to our national defense, my father, like so many others, volunteered to fight in the war, and he did so as a young Marine. And at age 19, he became a commissioned officer, a lieutenant in the Marine Corps, and was reported to be and documented to be the youngest combat Marine officer in World War II. He was sent over there at a young age as an officer responsible for his troops. The first difficult stop was Guam. And in Guam, he was asleep one night in his foxhole. And he woke up because he heard a noise rustling above him. And he looked up just in time to see a Japanese soldier coming in, stabbing him with his knife. He threw up his forearm, and for the rest of his life, he had 3 stab wounds down his arm. His runner, who was in the foxhole next to him, picked up his Colt 45, aimed it at the Japanese soldier, shot him dead, and the dead body, the corpse, dropped right on top of my father in his foxhole. For the rest of my father's life, he would wake up in the middle of the night screaming. He had nightmares about that. Then the next major battle, the worst of the war, as you pointed out, was Okinawa. In the battle for Okinawa, my father was wounded 7 times. He led his men into a ravine, and it was a trap. The caves, the pillboxes opened up with fire, and he lost most of his men, another harrowing experience that caused him great anguish and trauma the rest of his life. He'd send a runner back to try to get reinforcements or artillery support. Everyone he sent died, was shot dead. In that ravine, my father was shot in the head. We still have his helmet that has the bullet hole going in one side, coming out the other, slicing open his forehead. He was shot in the foot, and then he was shot in the neck. That was very, very bad. Once they survived that, the remaining men went back to camp, and he was talking to his best friend, his sergeant, Patty Doyle, only about 20 yards away. And a mortar landed on Patty's shoulder, blew his head off, sent shrapnel holes through both of my father's legs, knocking him many feet backwards. It was brutal. It was carnage. It was something that he really never got over the rest of his life. It was the worst battle of the war.
And he must have received a couple of medals for that.
He did. He got the Bronze Star with a V for valor, Purple Heart with gold stars in lieu of a second and third Purple Heart, victory medals, and all sorts of commendations. He ended up staying in the Marine Corps for 30 years, retiring as a full bird colonel.
Your father returned from the war with a passion to make a difference and chose to run for office at a very young age. What was that passion?
When my father fought in World War II, he fought alongside people of color, and they were given the most dangerous jobs. They would drive the munitions trucks, which were targets of the enemy that could explode. And having fought with them side by side, and he came home back to Baltimore County in Maryland, and he wanted to organize a veterans group with some other veterans, and they did so. And they invited everybody. And they went to a place that's out of business now, but it was called the Green Spring Inn. And here are these veterans, fresh home from the war, to have a dinner and a meeting to talk about veterans issues. And the proprietor wouldn't let them in because there were people of color with the group. He was outraged, offended, embarrassed, hurt. And so he didn't live too far away. So he invited them all back to his house. And they did this a number of times. And people, and that it was in the 1940s, below the Mason-Dixon line in Baltimore County in Maryland. He was referred to at the time as a traitor to his class for bringing people of color into his home. He didn't care. And he felt passionately that the way to change it was to step up, run for office, get elected, and be in a position where he could do something about basic human decency and civil rights for all.
After his service in the House of Delegates in Maryland and as a member of the House of Representatives in Washington, he was elected to the U.S. Senate in his 30s. Tell us more about his service in Washington.
Well, it was pretty remarkable, and you almost couldn't believe it. It's the stuff of movies. So he's elected as a United States Senator, as you said, in his 30s. His first hire to be his receptionist in his U.S. Senate office was a young lady fresh out of college named Nancy D'Alessandro Pelosi, the future Speaker of the House. And one of her duties was to give Capitol tours. So she started out giving tours of the Capitol that one day she would preside over. Then he hired Steny Hoyer, who would go on to be Majority Leader, the second most powerful person in the United States House of Representatives. They were both on his staff at the same time, and for many, many years they held the top two positions in Congress and still serve there today. Probably one of his proudest accomplishments was his bill that he was the sponsor of, that created and preserved the Assateague Island National Seashore, then slated for intense development. It would have been like Ocean City. He didn't want to see that. And so he got together some of his Senate colleagues to co-sponsor it, and he was in good graces with President Lyndon Johnson, and he got the bill through. And to this day, and in perpetuity, the Assateague Island National Seashore will continue. He also, with his passion for civil rights, it's important to point out, he was the only Democratic United States senator in the country that co-sponsored the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Fair Housing Act of 68. Those were things that were important to him and meant a lot to him. And we cherish the thank you letter that we have from Martin Luther King thanking him for his service. He also developed a great friendship with both Presidents Kennedy and Johnson and his colleagues, who they were forever grateful to him when he was presiding over the Senate and Wayne Morse was droning on forever. And you're not allowed to interrupt a senator, but my father had to go. And he rapped the gavel and adjourned the Senate and got up and left. Well, that caused quite a stir in the Senate. They loved him for doing it and elected him to Senate leadership. So his time in the Senate was one of accomplishment, one of support of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. But I will say this, he left the Senate with one huge lasting policy issue regret, and that was his support of the president's position on Vietnam. For the rest of his life, he thought of those tens of thousands of dead American troops and how we had no business being there in the first place. And that was his biggest regret from his time in the U.S. Senate.
It's worth pointing out that his stance on the civil rights issues was remarkable as the only Democratic senator. And it's worth pointing out to younger people today that so many Democrats in that period were Southern Dixiecrats and they were very opposed to any civil rights action at all. Speaking of Lyndon Johnson, your father stood in for President Johnson in the critical 1964 Maryland presidential primary, where he defeated the segregationist Alabama Governor George Wallace, a victory that directly contributed to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Tell us about the significance of that primary, its effects nationally, and on your father's personal condition and political future.
In the history of our entire nation, there's arguably never been a more important or significant piece of legislation than the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it all came down to Maryland, whether it was going to pass or fail, because the racist governor of Alabama, George Wallace, entered the Maryland presidential primary. And he was trying to win it, and he was going to run against President Lyndon Johnson. Well, Johnson, he'd only just become president a few months earlier on President Kennedy's assassination. So Johnson's busy being president. He wants to be respectful of the memory of our recently slain president, John F. Kennedy. So he asked my father, as the best vote getter in Maryland, to enter Maryland's presidential primary and to run against George Wallace. And he thought that with Brewster's popularity in Maryland, he'd beat him. And that way, if Wallace lost, the Civil Rights Act would pass. Well, the Civil Rights Act was being filibustered in Washington, meaning the senators wouldn't let it come up for a vote. And there weren't enough votes to cut it off, called cloture. So Brewster and Wallace debate for the Maryland presidential primary. The eyes of the nation are on Maryland for this race. Every newspaper, banner front page headlines, Brewster and Wallace debated on national TV on the leading talk show program Issues and Answers. My mother's life was threatened, and that was front page headlines too. They said, Senator Brewster, if you don't pull out, we're going to kill your wife, Carol. And it was brutal. It all came down to the last few weeks, and there was concern Wallace might win Maryland. So the Kennedy family got together and they decided, even though it was only a few months after their brother, the president, had been assassinated, that this issue of civil rights was too important, that their brother would want them to step up. So Ted Kennedy came to Maryland, their first campaign appearance since the president's assassination, and he and many other U.S. senators came, and they put on a full court press at the end. CBS Evening News, with Walter Cronkite reporting from New York, moved their national headquarters to Baltimore in the old Southern Hotel, and they covered it precinct by precinct, the results coming in and broadcast them to the nation. At the end of it, Brewster beat Wallace by over 10 percentage points. And within 24 hours of Brewster beating Wallace in Maryland's Democratic presidential primary, the head of the U.S. Senate Republicans, Everett Dirksen, went to the Democratic floor leader, Hubert Humphrey, and Dirksen said, the Republicans will join the Northern Democrats. Brewster beat Wallace. For the first time in our nation's history, we're going to break a civil rights filibuster. And they did. Within 24 hours, the filibuster was broken, and President Johnson signed it into law. It is a very, very important milestone and accomplishment that the citizens of Maryland did that day in that election.
Your father had lost re-election to the United States Senate in 1968, defeated by his very good friend, Charles Mack Mathias, then a four-term member of the House of Representatives. Explain the unusual circumstances of their relationship, the role of the Vietnam War, and your father's addiction to alcohol. Did their relationship endure after the election?
It was a remarkable friendship. Mac Mathias and Danny Brewster were roommates during law school. Mac Mathias met his wife, Ann, at a party at my father's farm where the Maryland Hunt Cup was held. They were best men in each other's weddings. Mac Mathias was my brother's godfather. They served in the U.S. House of Representatives together. So they were the best friends. But in the 1960s, while my dad was then in the U.S. Senate and Mac was still in the House, my father's alcoholism increased. That tough campaign against George Wallace, where he was booed, cursed, and spat upon, where he'd always been the leading vote getter and he thought everyone in Maryland loved him. Turned out not everybody did. And it struck him to his core. So he started to drink more. He suffered from alcoholism, and the Wallace campaign exacerbated it. So his best friend, Mac Mathias, came up to him and he said, Danny, you're on the wrong side of the Vietnam War. You're drinking too much. There have been questionable campaign contributions to your campaign. Danny, somebody's going to beat you. So it might as well be me. And he was right. And my father took it well and understood it. And it was a very friendly campaign, civil, based on the issues, not like what you see today. And here's a final footnote on that. After Senator Mathias beat my father for the U.S. Senate seat, the next Democrat to be elected president was Jimmy Carter in 1976. Mac Mathias was just this young Republican U.S. Senator, and he called up his old friend, former U.S. Senator Danny Brewster, who'd fallen on hard times. His world had kind of fallen apart. And Mac Mathias said, Danny, once a U.S. Senator, always a U.S. Senator. I want you to return to the Capitol and walk into President Carter's inauguration with me, with the United States Senate. And my dad said, oh, Mac, nobody's going to want to see me again. And Mac said, no, Danny, you're wrong. And I want you to come with me and do that. And he did. And my father was warmly embraced and hugged by his old colleagues. How many Republicans today would do that for a defeated Democrat? Those were different times. And it's a great tribute to Mac Mathias, who I would like to point out, Fred, you just wrote a great book. You co-edited a great book about Mac Mathias, Mathias of Maryland. I encourage everybody to get Fred Hill's book and read it. It's excellent. And it has chapters from all different kinds of people that worked with Mac or served with him in Congress. So I hope everyone will read Fred Hill's book on Mac Mathias as well.
Thank you, Gerry. Both books are very important, particularly today when there's such a divisive climate. Upon leaving office, your father was indicted on federal corruption charges in a case that went before the United States Supreme Court twice and was tried for weeks in a Washington, D.C. federal courthouse. I covered the case, as you remember, for the Baltimore Sun at the time in 1972, and it's where we first met. Please explain the Brewster case, how it came about, the political atmosphere of the time and its impact on your father.
Well, it was a very difficult time for my father and for all of us. And Fred, I remember well meeting you at the trial when you were covering it from the Baltimore Sun. And I was just 15 years old, but I left Gilman School to spend those weeks in Washington to be by my father's side. What had happened was, and it's a very complicated case that as you said, went to the U.S. Supreme Court twice. But what happened was my father's administrative assistant was caught pocketing campaign contributions, and he was about to be indicted, the administrative assistant, for doing that. But he said, "Oh no, wait a minute, I gave all the money to Brewster." So they said, "Oh, really? You gave it to the senator?" He said, "Oh, yeah." So he asked for immunity to testify against Brewster, and he did so. That administrative assistant was the only witness against my father, and he testified under oath that he gave all the money to Brewster. Well, an ambitious prosecutor ran with the case. It went on for 6 years, back and forth in courts and appeals, et cetera. And at the end of it, right before the end of it, the Nixon tapes came out during Watergate. And you can hear, I've listened to it, the live tape of President Richard Nixon instructing his henchmen in the Oval Office, this Danny Brewster case, let's go after it. Let's pursue that further. Contact the FBI and tell them to pursue this matter further because Brewster took those campaign contributions. So did other senators. And if we can get them, we can put enough pressure on Sam Ervin, the chairman of the Watergate Committee, to drop the Watergate investigation. Well, it's on tape. So at any rate, at the end of the trial and 6 years of litigation, my father was a broken man. He lost his job. He lost his family. He lost his farm. He lost his wealth. He lost his reputation. He lost his health. He had nothing. And at the end of it all, after 6 years, it was time to say enough is enough. So after all of that, he paid a $10,000 fine for accepting an unlawful gratuity without corrupt intent. He was one of the few members of Congress of that era to be certified by a jury of 12 to be non-corrupt. He was fined $10,000, and because there was no corruption, he was allowed to keep his law license. That was the end of it, but those 6 years destroyed him. And probably the worst mistake he made during that time was he divorced my mother, fell in love with Ann Bullitt, who was the daughter of the first U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, later ambassador to France. And she just wanted to be the wife of a senator. And when he lost his reelection, she jilted him and ran off. So the whole trial, the alcoholism, was a very dark time in my father's life.
And to make clear, the jury initially found it to be a felony, but then by appeal it was turned into a misdemeanor, correct?
Mostly correct. What happened was the original charges against him were felonies, and he was charged with accepting bribes. The jury unanimously, all 12 of them unanimously found him not guilty of bribery. Those were the charges with corruption. So then he was convicted of a lesser included offense of accepting an unlawful gratuity without corrupt intent. The appellate courts threw that conviction out. So that's not fair. You didn't charge him with that to start with. He didn't get a chance to defend himself.
Exactly.
And the distinction between a legal campaign contribution, a bribe, and an unlawful gratuity without corrupt intent is hopelessly confusing. So the government decided, with Nixon's orders, to prosecute him again, but they offered him an out, pay a $10,000 fine and be on your way. And at that point, he was a broken man, and that's how it was settled.
And it's important to point out the atmosphere of the time. You mentioned Nixon and what he was campaigning and trying to dodge the bullet himself. But just there was such, and I can remember it as a young reporter at the Sun, how strong the atmosphere, anti-government, anti-political, there was this fervor. So it's not surprising that there was this case, and as you say, an ambitious prosecutor, the Nixon pressure, and others. It's not surprising that the case came out that way. Your father suffered from alcoholism, as we know, which was the undoing of his career, his reputation, and more. But tell us about the impact of the alcoholism on your father's life and how he was finally able to overcome it.
So alcoholism is a devastating disease, and many people throughout the world have family members who suffer from it. And my father and his family were no exception. His alcoholism continued to progress, and after he lost his seat, his family, his farm, his finances, everything, it got worse. And he was hospitalized for 7 months. And he came out of the hospital and then in and out of treatment programs and rehab. Finally, his two brothers insisted that he go to a different place. They dragged him there, put him there. And finally, after this years and years of trying to overcome his alcoholism, it took. And one of the reasons why it took was he was on kitchen duty. And on kitchen duty, he saw this very attractive young lady who was also scrubbing dishes. And they started talking. And you're not meant to fraternize or socialize at rehab, but they did. And they fell in love. And they got out, they got sprung and ended up living together and falling in love and getting married and having 3 more children between the two of them. And he got another farm and got a mortgage to pay for it because his finances were shot. And then he gradually rebuilt a life of meaning and purpose where family and farming came first. And then in his remaining time on this earth, he found an opportunity to give back to the community again, and in pretty significant ways. He chaired the Governor's Commission on Alcoholism. He chaired the Maryland Korean War Memorial Commission. He chaired the Governor's Commission on AIDS. He was a member of the Baltimore Port Commission. He served on the board of the national parks, former members of Congress. And the thing that he was probably the most involved in, he chaired the board of a local Baltimore hospital. And then they merged with other hospitals, and it became a major health system that's now called MedStar. And he became the first chairman of that merger of hospitals. So he felt great duty to serve his country, even after all that he had been through. He continued that service until the very end, and he was happy to have worked the farm, loved his family, served the public. And he died a happy man at the end of a remarkable life that is so well told by John Freese in the new book, the critically acclaimed book, that's now actually a finalist for History Book of the Year, Self-Destruction, The Rise, Fall, and Redemption of U.S. Senator Daniel B. Brewster. And in closing, Fred, I'd just like to thank you again for conducting this interview. I'd also like to thank Edwin Warfield and CityBiz for making this possible. It's a great public service that you all do. We're very appreciative. Thank you.
Gerry, thank you very much. It's a remarkable story of recovery redemption. I enjoyed reading it. I've forgotten so much of it, even though the trial was almost 5 decades ago when we first met. But it is truly a remarkable story of someone, it's one that should inspire so many others who found themselves at rock bottom and then turned their life around to a life of meaning and purpose. I want to thank Edwin also, and thank the City Biz List and its audience for listening in, and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.